Welcome to a special edition of Articulation Live. I'm Scott Hockman, Education Associate for the Visual and Performing Arts at the South Carolina Department of Education. We're here at the Columbia Museum of Art today in Columbia, South Carolina to have a special tour of the Alchemy of Art, led by Brantley Hancock, who's a Crest Fellow here at the museum. Let's go in and meet some special friends. All right, we're back in the museum now in the second story atrium area, and we are in front of the Dale Chihuly chandelier sculpture. And it was purchased with funds that were donated through the contemporaries at the museum. And we're here now talking with Karen Brocious and Carrie Culkin Hornsby. And Karen is the director of the Columbia Museum of Art, and Carrie is the education director here. So Karen, please talk to our audience and tell them hello.
Welcome to all of you for coming today to visit the Columbia Museum of Art. We're grateful to have you here with us because we have a special tour in store for you. You're going to hear about our new program called the Alchemy of Art. And this program was funded through the Crest Interpretive Fellowship Program that is based in New York City. It's a national fellowship that selects talented individuals to research about arts education and working with curators. And we have a really special tour for you here today. With that, I'll turn it to Carrie.
Thank you for joining us at the Columbia Museum of Art. We have many programs specially developed for our educators and for students here. Our Evening for Educators is a free program held 4 times a year where we welcome educators to come learn about new exhibitions and ideas to take back and share in their classroom. All of our tours are led by a very well-trained docent corps and involve tours that connect to South Carolina standards as well as stimulating studio projects that also connect to standards and across the curriculum. And we welcome you to join us anytime here at the museum.
So we're back here and we have an exciting tour. We thank you for allowing our audience and the Department of Education to come into the museum today to view the Alchemy of Art. And now we're going to go into the galleries, and Brantley Hancock is going to direct our tour. So join us in the gallery.
So this is called the Alchemy of Art. Basically what we're doing is trying to understand how the evolution of painting materials and processes has precipitated a change and affected a change in artistic attitudes, artistic styles from the Renaissance through Impressionism. Alchemy, if you're familiar with it, is basically a proto-science in which the main concern was turning a crude substance like lead into something extremely invaluable, as in gold. And for this particular subject, the Alchemy of Art, our crude materials are pigments, they're binders, resins, and different raw materials that we have now turned into this alchemical substance called fine art that we see in museums. And we're going to start here in Gallery 2 with the Renaissance, or in International Gothic. Right here you see our triptych, the Virgin and Child Enthroned. Artists at this time were commissioned to create paintings like this, and it was never one single artist. It was a master painter who ran an entire workshop composed of many apprentices from ages 11 and up who were delegated tasks from sweeping, grinding pigments, to running out to the apothecaries to pick up different substances that they would then use to make paint. When I talked about some of the crude materials just a second ago, pigments, that is going to be the substance that gives paint its color and its body. In this time, we didn't have synthetic pigments, really. The first synthetic pigment was in Egypt, and that was first one until we get vermilion, which you see right here in Gabriel Michael's boot. It was actually an alchemical feat combining mercury and sulfur in a beaker. And after a chemical reaction happened, the red substance that formed around the beaker's edge was vermilion. But other than that, we would have an earth palette composed of the same pigments that have been in use since prehistoric times. The first paint factory was found in, I think it was from 100,000 years ago in South Africa, where they had red ochre pigment that you can see here. Carbon black, which is another one of the main 6 pigments we've had for all time, would be something like this you can see here. It's an example of an organic pigment, as in something that is made from a once living material or being. Inorganic pigments like lapis lazuli, the most expensive pigment in the Renaissance because it was imported from Afghanistan, is inorganic because it was from an element, from a mineral. Other important pigments to talk about are lake pigments. For instance, right here we have sap green, which was made from pulverized buckthorn berries. The thing about lake pigments is that they are actually insoluble, and they begin as insoluble dyes. So imagine that you have Kool-Aid. You can't really paint with Kool-Aid, you can stain something with it. But because there's not a particle, there's not some substance to really manipulate and stay adhered to the surface, you have to precipitate that dye onto a crystal. And that is what they would do for laking pigments. And so one example of how lake pigments, why they were so important to Renaissance art is this Mary Magdalene right here. If you zoom in right here and look at Mary Magdalene's face, you'll see a pretty common occurrence in Renaissance art is that sickly pallor. It looks like she still has the plague. That was actually, you're looking at the underpainting. In egg tempera painting, artists began working with an egg yolk, which they would prick with a needle or another sharp element, and then release the egg yolk from its membrane, set it aside. They would have pigment grind it up in a mortar and pestle that we'll see later, and then temper it on the lip of a clamshell. So you would have the muddy paste formed of pigment and water on the lip, and then mix it at will into the basin of the clamshell with your egg yolk, and that is your binder, which would adhere it to the surface. And so with this, they started out with verdaccio pigment, which is actually a mixture of 3 or 4 different pigments, what's called sort of like a color soup, in which any overlying layers actually should theoretically complement it because they have some color that would, in fact, complement it. Kind of like if you have a really great stock, and then for your main dish, you add chicken, it supports the flavor. Right here, they started with the verdaccio, the yellowish white. Here it's blue-green leaning. They would then put a rose lake-colored pigment over top, perhaps some from a madder root, which is a vegetable extract in Europe that could be bought at the apothecaries. But the thing about these organic laked pigments is they are called fugitive colors. They fade very quickly over time, and so that is why over time these pigments the color paint has faded, and now you can no longer see it, and she looks like she's just resurrected from the plague. Another very important thing about Renaissance paintings is the gold leaf process. Gold leaf was regularly applied to a red surface or a red sticky substance called red bull. You can see some right here. It's actually a sticky wet clay that has been imported from Armenia, showing just how essential foreign trade was to even these people in the 13th, 14th centuries. So red bull was applied as sticky clay to a white gessoed surface. The gesso was made from rabbit skin glue, which is basically melted, granulated rabbit collagen, and a white pigment, and then put atop a wooden board. The Armenian red bull would then be re-wetted over top the gesso using the artist's spit. What's more economical than that? And then rabbit skin or gold leaf would be applied using a burnisher, which would have been a dog's tooth. So artists were always using ready-made materials, not necessarily buying them. Another important thing to know about artists at this time was that they were members of the Doctors and Apothecaries Guild. Because they were so well respected for their knowledge of pigments, inherent working qualities, and the ways in which they would interact. Because these pigments are all made from different elements and minerals that could potentially be hazardous to one another if laid without reference to their materials and how they would correspond with each other. So now we're going to head to Gallery 3 and talk about another binder called Glare. Okay, and here in Gallery 3, we are going to talk about another binder, or the adhesive that is used from an eggshell. So basically, with egg tempera, you have the egg yolk, but these artists were always economical. They were working on another person's dollar, and to maximize their own funds, of course they wanted to use everything as frugally as possible. So they ended up making a binder from the egg white called Glare. If you were to take the egg whites left over from, say, baking a cake or whatever substance you need egg whites for, you could put them in a jar, shake them up very, very vigorously, and after a period of time, after the whites have settled, there will be a really thin, viscous little substance that is the egg white or glare that you can then use to paint with. So illuminated manuscripts are generally used with glare. They were popular, books like these, Books of Hours, were the most high-selling book at this time, illuminated manuscript, because they were daily devotionals. They're sort of the Italian, or the Northern European answer to Italian altarpieces as far as personal devotion goes. These were illustrated by monks in monasteries. A manuscript literally means handwritten. They have miniatures. The miniature paintings like these are actually not named for their size, surprisingly. They're actually named for one of the pigments that was used called minium, which is most likely that red pigment seen in the background behind the angel and the Virgin Mary. How these would actually be painted, though, is from dyed bits of cloth. The manuscript illuminators would have some stored up and then re-wet them whenever they were about to work on a particular color. So, for instance, sometimes they would use saffron, which would probably be imported from Iraq or Spain, for sort of a gold leaf substitute, just something that's a little more affordable. So they would take a bit of cloth that was stained with the saffron and wet it with glare to be reused later. The same for cochineal lake, which is actually still a red food dye in many of our favorite soft drinks today. That was actually sort of the key to Spanish fortune right around the conquest of Mexico. After they discovered these native Mexicans' beautiful scarlet robes, they found that they were getting this color from some beetles that lived on a specific breed of cactus. So this color became immensely popular, especially in paintings and manuscripts, as a lake pigment. So you can see this here. Unfortunately, this kind of beautiful, exacting painting went out of style in the 1450s, which is right around the time our example is from, because of the invention of the printing press by Johann Gutenberg. So as you can see, sometimes innovation, technological innovation, sort of spurred artistic invention or abandonment of certain styles. And now we're going to get to yet another kind of painting, which will be fresco painting. We're going to look here at our Botticelli. Sorry. It's actually the only Botticelli outside of Italy, so come see it at the Columbia Museum of Art. So fresco painting is an exception to the typical formula of 3 ingredients for a painting. Instead of having an added binder, as in egg temper, oil, acrylics, etc., fresco paintings have no binder at all, really. The surface itself is the binder. So with frescoes, you would use pretty much the same pigments. All of these pigments are the same as ones you've seen in the previous gallery, except they were ground in lime water and then adhered to a layer of plaster in the buono fresco method while it was still wet. That is buono fresco. If you were to apply it to a dry fresco or a dry layer of plaster, it would be fresco secco. But with a buono fresco, while painting into the wet plaster, a chemical reaction actually happens. As the water evaporates, a crystalline calcium carbonate surface forms, and so the pigments are actually encased within the plaster itself and become inherent and integral to the wall. So you see here this lapis lazuli is part of the wall now, as are all of these pigments that you see here. Another very interesting point about pigments in frescoes are the properties of the red ochre pigment that are made of iron oxide. Iron molecules actually realign themselves to true north after being encased behind this crystalline surface. So if you know the year in which a particular painting was made, you can actually verify what direction or where exactly true north was located for that year and vice versa. If you know true north for a certain year, but you don't know when this was painted, it's not documented anywhere, you can actually verify by where the iron molecules are pointing. And then one more thing to look at right here is sort of the development and a growing interest in naturalism and linear perspective. Botticelli right here has used a series of receding squares within the baldacchino or the stable walls to get you to look straight through here into the background. One point perspective was developed by Filippo Brunelleschi in the early 1400s. So this, coupled with the oil medium that we're going to see in the next gallery, is actually one reason why the paintings that you see in oil are so naturalistic and lifelike. So in the 15th century, the oil medium had become especially popular with artists in the north. As you can see, they have an intense interest and aptitude for images of an infinitesimal calculus, as they say, where you just the more you look and the deeper you look into the scene, the more it yields more interest and more details. They were very interested in optics. They were some of the first to experiment with lenses and binoculars, telescopes, etc. So you can see here how much they wanted and were ready to jump on anything as an oil that could mimic and replicate stained glass, the optics, anything like that. With an oil medium, what was used in the north was walnut oil. It was an easy jump from using it on their on their dining room table for dressings or for cooking. It was easy to do that, to think, oh, well, if I put pigments in here, it's going to suspend them, it's going to be more gelatinous, and increase the reflective and refractive properties. So they started out with this, and they would generally start with a white ground, as in the Renaissance, and the International Gothic way, ag tempera. And then they would put an imprimatura, which is a thin veil of color, followed by perhaps an isolating varnish, which is made of plant resins, tree resins. So if you ever touch a pine tree and you feel that sap on your hands, that's resin. And what varnish would do is it actually increases the distance or the length in which a light ray has to travel through, so that it increases the optical and the luminosity of paintings. So that's exactly what has been done here. It's been a series of, in this brocaded fabric, which is just stunning, it's a series of varnishes. They're on glazes of different colors. So we probably started with a lead white with an isolating layer, so the lead wouldn't interact with any other pigments. And then perhaps a crimson or a cochineal lake, and then maybe even a little vermilion and lead tin yellow, in all different series of different viscosities. Viscosity being the liquid friction or internal friction of a liquid, which could be adjusted by a solvent, which becomes extremely important for oil painters. We'll look at this painting right here of Fra Bartolomeo, which is actually sort of illustrative of an Italian approach to oil painting. They seized on it a little bit more slowly, more quickly in Venice because of their proximity to the northern states. But you can see it's just a much more atmospheric use of color, in which they generally lines blend together, not so many sharp edges. But still, you can see the difference in the deep saturation and the importance of an indirect method right here in the sleeve, where the paint the image emerges over a series of layers. This wasn't all painted at once. You would have the red ochre background that sort of peeks through right here, and then followed by the flesh tone, and then a little bit of white, a little bit of blue, and then an even darker color. So that is what was precipitated at this time by oil medium. So an increased ability to get different textures, which is also very important for the northern countries who are becoming more wealthy with their trading, and also more, they were more proud of what they owned and like to illustrate that in paint. So now we'll get to this piece right here, in which you can actually see that at play. This is a painting of Mary Magdalene, in which you can almost feel that velvet and the lace between your fingers, just illustrating the fact that artists were so, and people themselves, the public who are commissioning this, were extremely proud of the materials that they owned and wanted them to be depicted well. Another painting we have here is from a follower of Leonardo da Vinci. As you can see, her face is shrouded in that sfumato layer characteristic of the Mona Lisa. Sfumato is from the Italian for to smoke, sfumare, sort of to veil, to vanish. This is actually achieved only by oil paints, because they take an extremely long time to dry through oxidation. So because of their very slow drying time, they can easily be manipulated with a fan brush that would be sort of swept across to create a vacillating outline. Whereas egg tempera paints, once they are applied, they're dry. That's it. You can layer, but no adjusting. So now we'll get to Venice. All right, so now we're going to talk about Jacopo Robusti, or Tintoretto, and the painters of Venice. There's a huge difference in the climate of the northern European countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Venice, which is obviously surrounded by water. There's an extreme amount of humidity, which is very, very bad for panel paintings that have been primed with a rabbit skin glue size, because the rabbit skin glue continues to adjust and fluctuate to minute changes in humidity, and then the wood panel will adjust with humidity and the water absorption. So that's one reason why we have climate control in museums, is to account for all of this change. But in Venice, this was a huge problem. So they quickly seized on to something that makes perfect logical sense. What do we have a lot of? We have a lot of water, a lot of ships, a lot of sails, so a lot of canvas. So canvas became the primary working surface for artists at this time. A few important things about canvas is that it can be easily rolled up, and so it's very portable for artists that are traveling a lot, like Da Vinci to the Duke of Milan, or the Duchy of Milan, and etc. And then also it has a very rough surface. It has this tooth that is sort of greedy and gobbles up paint, except it has a much rougher molecular surface. So that's one reason why wood panel paintings are generally so smooth, whereas canvas paintings have more rougher textual qualities. Another reason that paintings like this appear so rough in sections, say like this, and even if you get right here, you can sort of see the lines of the brush as they move across the canvas, is because the Chinese hog hair bristle brush became popular at this time, because the way that its bristles are naturally sort of floppy like this, you would set them across from, or like this, opposite each other, and they have this distinct snap. It's a very nice snap that enabled impasto, or heavy paint loading on the tip of the brush, so you could do scumbles and stuff like that. Tintoretto used this to his advantage, because he would actually work very, very rapidly with his bottega, or family workshop. This is supposedly one of his daughters right here who trained under him. But he would use this so rapidly and create his own, I guess, signature style that we haven't seen yet, without the hog hair bristle brush that showed such personality in paintings, that he would charge for his paintings at cost, which is pretty interesting for this time period. But we'll get into Gallery 7. Okay, with artists working in the 17th century, you see a lot of this use of chiaroscuro, which is contrast of light and dark. We could say that this is just simply a stylistic thing, but it wasn't necessarily. Artists at this time were receiving huge commissions from the church, the government, but also they were starting to receive commissions from a growing middle class and people with more expendable income. This would have probably been for a church because of its subject of David and Goliath, but this is also an example, a very good example of chiaroscuro, because it's painted by one of Caravaggio's followers, the main chiaroscuro man, if we want to call him that. Painters seized onto this really because it was such an economical thing. They would first paint the entire background with a very, very dark color that is probably seen right here, sort of an umber, brown umber, one of those earth colors again, and then build up from there. So they already have that darkest tone. They have the darkest tone made. It's already inherent in the piece, and then all they have to do is gradually add in their middle and half tones, and then the highlights that they would generally do in a very opaque scumble, or simply an opaque brush stroke. So that's one way they started being economical about their profession. Another thing when you get to the 17th century is you start to see more of an emphasis on the intellectual. The artist is an intellectual. The Accademia in, I believe, Florence was founded in part to make sure the artists started to be seen less as craftsmen and less as blue collar, I guess, from doing their paint mixing, and all to more white collar, as in they're adept in anatomy. They're adept in geometry with linear perspective. It also shows that they're more rational, being familiar with line, which doesn't actually exist in nature. Being able to portray contours and etc. is more intellectual, more impressive. So the French Académie des Beaux-Arts was founded in 1648 to address problems like this. And this is the quintessential example of what an academic painting would want to be like. The colors are kind of lifeless right now, probably because of just age and varnish. But it's dramatic. It's a history painting depicting a scene from the Bible. So it portrays an academic knowledge and an intelligence, and also an ability to portray images with such naturalism. They were also forbidden to mix their own colors at this time. So artists who had previously been working with paint from start to finish by purchasing the materials themselves to actually mixing them and applying them with the brush were now just being handed a palette and told paint. So they lost their knowledge of materials' working properties. So now we're going to start to see how that affected painting in the 17th century, or 18th century. So now we're getting into Gallery 6, which is actually the 18th century. With the 18th century, you have several important changes happening. One is with the public who is buying art. It's now not only just the religious and political elite, but also tourists. We have the English Grand Tour that became really popular around this time. Generally, it would be aristocratic young men who were doing a sojourn in Italy and the continent to cap off their classical education. So they'd spend about 2 years abroad and would always want to have painted souvenirs of their journeys. So one really neat thing about this time is that artists started working on speculation. In other words, they started saying, if I paint this, they will come and buy it. Instead of simply waiting for that moment when someone comes to them and says, you know, I want you to paint this for me with these ingredients, these materials for X amount of money. So Canaletto is one just exemplary artist who is exemplary of this time period. He was extremely popular for his veduti paintings, or his view paintings. Some people would think, well, is he just a genius to be able to get such accurate perspective? But maybe he was. But he was helped in that by a camera obscura, which is actually a very strange. It can be in different forms. The one he used would have been about yay big, and it had a series of lenses that he would look through at the image that he was wanting to portray, and the images, or the mirror, a series of mirrors would flip it, and so then he would have it on a surface and be able to trace it. So then he would take this scene back into the studio and perfect it himself. He was the son of a stage designer, so you can see in some of these scenes just how into the fact that he was portraying a scene. You see a little guy playing with a dog right there, a man sort of gesturing to some of his friends over here. So you have painters like this working and even advertising themselves. There's evidence of some brochures that Canaletto has advertising his wares, saying, come see me in my studio. I will paint you something you will love, you will adore. And if you couldn't afford a painting, you could always have an engraving. So there's a huge shift in artistic identity at this point and the artistic audience. So now, and also a huge shift in the painting industry. In the mid-1800s, colormen became a very prominent profession, or sort of the middleman with painting materials. So they started to stock paint themselves, or they would manufacture it sort of and store it in pig bladders. So little squares of cut out pig bladders. They would then seal and store them on their shelf for a few days, hoping that someone would come buy it. The artist would buy it, prick it with a little pin, and then squirt it out and seal it back up until he needed it again. That's one reason why we don't have plein air painting in the 18th century, because pig bladders are a little sensitive. So now we're going to get and see how these artists who were no longer using their materials, some of the effects that could have. Canaletto was good, some others were not so successful. So I'm going to Gallery 9. This painting has a tentative attribution to Sir Joshua Reynolds, an 18th century English painter, an extremely popular portraitist. This particular painting is only tentative, in my opinion, because it's not riddled and sort of a muddy disaster. One thing that Reynolds was famous for trying to do was mimic old master painting effects, and because he was no longer mixing his media himself, he wasn't really familiar with what effect the addition of wax or certain brittle resins into his paint medium would be. He was trying to mimic like old masters like Rembrandt with their McGill medium. So sometimes he would even use a certain ingredient called asphaltum, which is actually a sort of bitumen. Basically, if you drove today, you rode on top of it. It's an additive in asphalt, which actually never dries when used as a paint medium. It may be lovely, but it would always end up running down the painting. And so patrons would often return his paintings back to him and say, "You need to fix this for me within a matter of weeks or even months." He also was unaware of the effect of certain varnishes on his paintings. As you can see, this green, it would have been something perhaps like a copper resonate green, how it has faded over time, and so it just looks murky and brown. This and another very strange substance that could have been used at this time was called mummy brown, actually manufactured from Egyptian mummies. So these are sort of the crazy lengths that painters in the 18th century went to when they were no longer familiar with their materials. And then once you get to the 19th century, you start seeing people that are a little more interested in the origins of their painting, the origins of their painting materials and supplies. Yeah, I sort of like to liken them to people very interested in the origins of their food. Organic food buyers, they want to know, well, how are these materials prepared? Because they've seen that sometimes the addition of additives like wax to sort of, well, wax was used as a filler often in the 19th and early 20th century to try and keep the oil medium and the pigment together. Artists like Monet and other impressionists, Degas, etc., would also often use a technique called peinture à l'essence, which is when they would blot their oil paintings using simply a blotting paper to try and remove all of that excess oil. Because what oil does is it yellows over time, and that's one reason why Impressionist paintings appear so beautiful and pastel and matte, is because they don't have this excess of oil. The oil often attributes the glossiness to a painting. So when you see an oil painting, it's very glossy. It perhaps has a lot of varnish, or it has a lot of oil. Painters at this time were also able to work very quickly because they didn't have to prepare their grounds. They had pre-prepared grounds and canvases. Because of the Industrial Revolution, which happened about 1750 to 1850, was the big time of that. And in addition to this, painters like Monet, who did a series like this of 14 paintings of the same, he would go every morning to the same scene and paint 14 different canvases over the matter of 3 or so hours. And he was able to do this because he had mass-produced materials, he had mass-produced canvases, pre-prepared paints, and a collapsible paint tube that was developed in 1841 by an American. So we do have a very important American addition to European and worldwide painting as a whole. So that is yet another example of how technological innovation, the evolution of painting materials, has precipitated the alchemy of art. And book your tours by calling Kaylee Vaughn at the Columbia Museum of Art. Her number is 803-343-2163.
Hi, now I'd like to welcome you to our studios. Each school program we offer has a studio component. Students come in and are able to have a hands-on activity that relate to the tour that they have just taken. These connections make for a stronger program, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to Brantley, and she's going to show you the studio component to the Alchemy of Art.
So in this component, this is actually one we'll probably use for our summer camp series. We're actually going to make a lake pigment like ones that we discussed in the studio. For this particular instance, I'm going to use coffee because we brew it in the lobby. It's very convenient. For you, you could use something that's convenient to your household. Maybe your mom likes a lot of spinach, or maybe you're a carrot fan. You can actually boil down these ingredients, chop them up, boil them down for about 5 minutes, and then strain them of the excess debris, and then do this experiment right at home. So for this, use some coffee. Here we have just the regular coffee here. I'm going to pour it in and then add alum, which is a colorless crystal potassium aluminum sulfate. You can actually buy it at your local grocery store, most likely, in the baking section. They actually use it for pickling recipes. And then you're going to add, after it's all combined, you're going to add some baking soda, otherwise known as sodium bicarbonate, which is actually going to create this chemical reaction. This is actually forming a precipitate, as you can see, in which a solid is formed in a liquid. This is really fun to do with different materials, because sometimes the results are very unexpected. Try a red onion, you don't get red. So what you do after all of this foam is formed is put it in a shallow evaporation tray. You could probably fill up 1 or 2 of these trays themselves. Even try to do several rounds and sort of graduate them. So the first round of baking soda, you have 1 pan. The second round, you have another. You'll get tonal variations, which are always interesting. And after you've filled up one of these evaporation trays, you're going to leave it in the sun for probably about 3 days until it gets like this, turns cracked, all the water is evaporated. You can scrape it to your mother's dismay. And then you're going to take that and scrape it all up and pour it into a mortar and pestle. Mortar and pestle that your mom may have for grinding herbs and spices. You're going to grind it all up into a very fine powder. And then after that, you will have your pigment. So here is coffee pigment made from coffee. And then you could always add a binder to this and make paint. And then in addition to that, we're going to make pastel paper, which is a component of our middle and high school and elementary school programs. So for this, you would take your coffee. You would also add rabbit skin glue in its granulated form. Mix some of that up. Yes, that's rabbit skin. It's very gross. This is actually it in its liquefied form. Lots of times for preparing panel size, you will soak it in water overnight and it expands. See how it absorbs water? So that is actually it. It's very, very tough. You can actually save this in your refrigerator and store it, and then just microwave it. No metal lids attached. Don't make that mistake like I did. And you're going to add this, stir it all up, Add some fine pumice powder. You can get this at Hobby Lobby or any other store used for soap or candles, generally soap making. Stir that up. And for our purposes, I already have some ready. So what you'll do is brush it on like that. Use any kind of little variations you want. Make it look fun and old. This is good to make it look like an old ancient vellum manuscript. Vellum being animal hides. So for what we have, doing an illuminated manuscript, this will be the final, this is sort of the example of our final high school project. So what we're going to do is apply some gold leaf. So I've gone through the stages here, from making your pastel paper that has that tooth to it that is reminiscent of actual animal skins, to tracing on a letter, and added the colored pencil. So I'm not using actual 18 karat gold leaf because we are a nonprofit after all. So I'm using simply the regular synthetic gold leaf you can buy in any store. And then first you're going to add an adhesive size that replicates the Armenian red bowl we talked about in the Renaissance galleries. Going to apply it. Generally, you want to be much more precise about this, but in the interest of time, I'll take a piece, lay it very delicately, and sort of press it down. You can see where it's willing to adhere very, very easily and right off. Generally, they would use something like a dog skin or a dog tooth to burnish this. Just simply means polish. But in our time, we're going to use something like the end of a paintbrush. Also today, agate is sometimes used. And you're also just going to use a very fine brush to sort of loosen the gold leaf away. And then if there's ever an area that's scant, don't worry about that. It actually looks kind of nice, especially because it replicates the effects of old paintings themselves, because the glue actually dries to a red tone, which actually just heightens the effect of the gold leaf, because that red and the yellow sort of activate each other. And then following that, you would simply add some gold leaf sealer. Very thinly, don't let it pool up. And then, assuming that you've gotten it all through and mounted it to a very beautiful piece of paper, you could have a project like this. A for Alchemy in this case. But if you'd like to ever perform this with your students, you don't have to necessarily keep it so traditional. You can get a little more fun with it, maybe make it about geometry, associate some shapes in that, or maybe think Americana, get into some nice block letters and stuff reminiscent of advertising. These are some examples that I've done at USC with their painting course. This is a replica of one of our Book of Hours pages using traditional animal skin vellum and lapis lazuli, malachite, which is a mineral, and then some vermilion as well. And then also another one using gold leaf. And then if you were to bring your students to our studio, they'll get the opportunity to not necessarily use gold leaf, but understand the properties and the characteristics of gold leaf, and also the history of guild workshops and the alchemy of art. So again, if you ever do want to book a tour and a coordinating studio component, call Kaylee Vaughn at 803-343-2163.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Articulation Live. I'm Scott Hockman, Education Associate for the Visual and Performing Arts, and we'll hope we take an advantage of joining us at the museum anytime that you can be in Columbia, and bring those students so that you can see the Alchemy of Art and the other terrific shows that are here at the museum.